Saudi oil reserves on fire. Fortunately, they've got a friend in Trump. Ed Blakely is a former Washington insider now living in Sydney, Australia. My name is Sean Britton from the radio station 2SER. If you enjoy what you hear on US of Ed, do us a favour and drop us a review wherever you happen to catch this podcast. And you can always seek us out on social media. US of Ed on Facebook and Twitter. Saudi Arabia under attack, half of the country's oil capacity taken out, with the US pointing the finger at Iran. What's going on?
Well, it's hard to know who to point the finger at. I doubt if Iran would want to do this because that would make them a target. They depend on oil, and the U.S. could knock them out very easily with a similar strike with a drone. There are a lot of combatants in Yemen who are hostile to Saudi Arabia. Getting a drone isn't as hard as it used to be. And so getting one that'll fly that short flight path is pretty easy. So there are obviously some people who are hostile to Saudi Arabia who want to get the Saudi Arabians out of Yemen. And they should be out of Yemen. The U.S. has said they should be. However, this is a situation where these are Trump allies, not U.S. allies. Saudi Arabia is not an ally of the United States, but an ally of Mr. Trump. Remember, he covered up a murder for the Saudis. So this is going to get pretty heated pretty quick, and I anticipate a retaliatory move by the U.S.
As you kind of hit on right there, the US has been pretty quick to blame Iran for a few incidents lately that people have felt, maybe a little bit shaky. Trump initially said the US was locked and loaded for a response and has been a little bit more reticent since then. But still, with all this going on Iran, is military intervention in the country inevitable?
Well, I would say it's getting close to that. He needs this for the polls. He needs this for his own reelection. He's created this crisis. There wouldn't be any crisis if he hadn't taken Iran on for reasons he's never been able to articulate. He's never said what was wrong with the Obama treaty other than it wasn't tough enough on nuclear weapons. Well, you didn't have to ban the treaty to get him tough on nuclear weapons. That certainly wasn't the direction to go in. So he's looking for a fight. I don't think Iran, and I've been to Iran, are the right people to fight with.
And just, one final point on this, taking a little bit of a step back. Where is Trump's foreign policy right now? He's been back and forth. This is it. Iran, back and forth. He withdrew, obviously from the treaty that we had there. North Korea has been pushed right off the agenda. Taliban breakdown last week. We know how China is going. Where is the agenda?
Well, it's even worse than that. The entire Pacific, as we know here in Australia, is under threat because Trump is absent from these discussions. We have an entire set of issues with respect to the Middle East other than what's going on in Saudi Arabia, including Kuwait and other places. So Mr. Trump has thought, like any big businessman, he could put his mind to anything and keep it there. And then when that problem was solved, he could move on to the next one. But the world does not work that way. Problems come up every single day. And if you don't have a consistent way of dealing with them, more of them crop up. So the absence of him having any kind of consistent foreign policy makes this a very dangerous world. And he's humbling the American allies in Europe and crippling them. So the United States cannot be a strong player anymore.
Supreme Court Judge Brett Kavanaugh, more sexual abuse allegations surfacing this week that supposedly the FBI failed to follow up on. Some calling for Kavanaugh's impeachment. How likely is it to see a Supreme Court judge impeached?
Not likely at all. If that were going to happen, it would have happened a long time ago with some other judges who'd seriously breached ethics and the faith. Normally, they'll resign before that. The terrible thing about this is Kavanaugh is getting pushed into a corner here, in the right corner. The more people push at him, the more he has to defend Trump. And I'm not sure he always wants to, but he has to have someone there ready to defend him. Certainly, the Chief Justice isn't going to help him, and other members of the court. So this is a play into the hands of the very people you don't want to play into, the right wing, who are staunch Kavanaugh supporters, not because they like him. They don't give a stuff about sexual allegations, but they want someone on the court who'll do their bidding. And Kavanaugh's turning out to be that person.
And speaking of the courts, the White House has instructed former Trump aides Rick Dearborn and Rob Porter to ignore subpoenas and not appear before the House in what would be another pretty blatant dismissal of accountability for the White House. How does this go on, Ed?
Well, I don't know how it goes on. Other people have respect for the law. This man doesn't. And this has to be escalated to the courts. He is playing for time here. He doesn't want whatever these gentlemen would have to say to be in the record. If they go on the stand and they're caught lying, they can go to jail. So to prevent them from going to jail, prevent them from going to the hearing, and then fight the hearing in the courts, and hopefully that'll go well beyond the election. That's where this is headed for. More time, more blah, 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 and less action.
And almost 50,000 General Motors workers on strike over negotiations on wages, healthcare and job pathways a decade after bankruptcy for the company. The union also fighting to stop GM from closing car assembly plants in Ohio and Michigan, which the company says is a response to changes in the market. We circle back. We were talking foreign policy a moment ago. The Trump agenda, jobs in the Rust Belt. What's going on?
Well, first of all, those jobs are being lost because of things that are happening around the world. Automation. Automation is taking hold. Robots are doing more and more work, and that's going to continue. Trying to save American manufacturing jobs probably means to automate them, not to have workers doing them. So this is a much bigger agenda than just automobiles and automobile companies. For Americans to be employed, they've got to be making something that has a world asset value. What is that going to be? Fortunately, the U.S. has very strong capacities in this area, in healthcare, in communications, and many other areas of technology. But to be in those areas, you have to have more than a high school education. So these people are really stuck. They're very far behind the eight ball, primarily because so many presidents tried to save their jobs. And by saving their jobs, they made them far more fragile when the job cuts come around.
Turning overseas, Israel, we're a little bit early this week, so at time of recording, the two contenders are basically neck and neck. I've just looked it up, and 92% of the vote counted. Netanyahu slightly ahead. Either way, it doesn't look like either side are going to hold a majority. So either way, bad news for Bibi, Ed.
It's bad news for Israel. And in some ways, it reflects what going on in the United States, the nation divided. And the nation is divided here on whether you sue for peace with the Arabs or you try to plummet them into oblivion. Now, the first strategy has real dangers. That who you're talking to. You talking to Hezbollah? You talking to the legitimate government that's on the West Bank? Who are you talking to? And what can they say that would comfort you? The second part of this is that if you try to destroy them, you're doing exactly what Hitler did. And it's not that far along. There are people with memories, and those memories will come into sharp reality.
Certainly long memories in Israel, let's face it.
Yep. So I would not want to be running that government, and no one's asked.
I'd vote for you, Ed, mate. But briefly on Brexit, I was saying around the time Boris got the Queen to prorogue Parliament, I don't understand how he's done this. I don't understand how you could get such a nakedly political act signed off on. And it would seem the answer is through lying. The courts following Boris into this week with extraordinary accusations, well, against the British PM.
Yep. Yep. I guess when the leader of the biggest and most important nation in the world is a constant liar, and you're a showman too, why not continue that tradition? So he's lied his way in. Can he lie his way out? I think that's the bigger question. He will have to answer to an awful lot of people, both those people pro and those people anti-Brexit, because these lies have jeopardized both positions.
And just before we talk about our Democratic candidate of the week, wanted to talk a little bit more about gun policy with Beto O'Rourke grabbing people this week in the Democratic debate saying, we're going to take your AR-15, your AK-47, we're not going to allow it to be used against our fellow Americans anymore. Advocating for a forced buyback a step further than any other Dems, Ed. How do you see this one sort of being received?
I think it's going to be well received. We're beyond fed up. We're fed up. As my grandma used to say, you can't put this food on that table. So anyone who's trying to put the food of guns on the table is going to be crucified. The NRA's contributions have hit an all-time low. I anticipate within the next 2 or 3 years, much like the drug companies, the number of suits against the NRA and against gun companies is going to be overwhelming. The NRA cannot save itself from these suits because it's been saying guns are good. So they're acting as a propaganda arm for something the American Medical Association says is a health danger. Watch this space.
And as I say, over the last few weeks, we've been talking about some of the contenders for Democrats in the 2020 race. This week, feeling the burn, Bernie Sanders. What is there to say about Sanders that hasn't been said, Ed?
Nothing. No, Bernie's trying to clean up his rhetoric, not to be so strident, to put himself in what you call the left mainstream. How do you do that? Well, instead of calling for universal health care, you call for Medicare for all, an existing policy being expanded. Instead of calling for huge reforms in the Voting Rights Act and things like that, you ask that the existing laws be enforced. And instead of appealing to the very, very far left and immigrants who don't vote, you appeal to the progressives, and you start campaigning more in the suburbs and less on inner city issues. Bernie's trying all this. The trouble is the shoe doesn't fit the foot. He was better off on campuses, but doing a round of talking on campuses, you can only do that once. And both Beto and Bernie have burned out the campus circuit.
Look, I think Sanders can be credited a lot with the Democrats' leftward push at the moment. We've discussed
yes. He's a leader. He is a person who's a staunch supporter of, here we're calling left. I think in Europe, they'd say these people are in the center.
Yeah. Well, that's,
health care, child care, basic wages, basic education. These are left-wing ideas. We seem to have had those ideas when I was a kid.
It's one of the points of great confusion. I talk to people about this one, and I have to explain to them, American politics, you don't realize until you get into it, is a lot more rightward. And over here in Australia, the Liberals are a big L. They don't, the little L Liberals are the ones on the left. The big L, they're the ones on the right.
Well, the thing that's happened to the left basically is the decline of labor and the labor movement. There isn't a single country in the world where the labor movement has strength. And Italy is a prime example of that, where the labor unions have lost so many people that you have a right-wing government in that is not popular because it doesn't have a lot of voter support from the very groups that they'd want it. That is from workers' groups. And the workers are complacent, they're split up, and the like. The same thing's true in the United States, the same thing's true in Australia. The labor movement, there's a thing called the Labor Party. If you can find someone who's ever held a job in the labor movement, who's ever held a labor card of any kind, I'd be darn surprised. So the labor movement is caught in a direction of change that cannot happen, bringing back manufacturing. That cannot happen. Being environmentally friendly at the same time, that cannot happen. Somehow, the left, the liberals, whoever you want to call them, have to come up with some sane policies and not be angry all the time.
Ed and I will be back next week to talk the latest in US news and politics. Drop us a review wherever you happen to find the podcast and seek us out on social media, Facebook and Twitter, US of Ed.